Welcome to another episode of This Fucking Guy, the video series where we pick out a fucking guy making America worse and explain why they suck. I'm Erin Ryan, host of Crooked Media's Hysteria Podcast.
And I'm Alyssa Mastromonaco, the other host of Crooked Media's Hysteria Podcast.
On this episode, we're going to highlight the life and times of somebody who, I've become convinced, would have become a serial killer if they hadn't become one of the 9 most powerful people in America.
That's a bold statement, and in the spirit of the legal field, I know you're going to back it up.
So for legal reasons, let me clarify that I'm kind of joking here, but also, this guy's got everything, say a Ted Bundy or Ed Kemper might have. A history of abuse, an unstable family life, possible childhood pyromania, an obsession with very weird pornography that he freely discusses at inappropriate times. And, you know, if you consider how many times he stood up for polluters, capital punishment, and guns, and against the lives of women while in a position of power, he's arguably got a higher body count than most American murderers. I'm speaking, as you might have surmised, about Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas.
Okay, I usually agree with you, but I think you're being a little unfair.
Wow, Alyssa Mastromonaco, I never had you pegged as a Clarence Thomas defender.
The one thing watching a lot of Law & Order SVU has taught me is that serial killers are often charismatic, and our buddy Clarence here has the riz of a wet rock.
But you gotta watch out for the quiet ones, the silent but deadlies, if you will. Okay, so let's get started. Clarence was born into extreme poverty in a small town called Pinpoint in coastal Georgia to a woman named Leola Williams, who was, at the time, shotgun married to the man who had gotten her pregnant in the 10th grade. Thomas's father would later divorce his mother and abandon the family to start another family when Thomas was only 2 and Leola was pregnant with her 3rd child. Only a few generations before that, Thomas's ancestors were enslaved people. Thomas's childhood was hardscrabble. He was raised in a shack by his custodial aunt while his mother traveled to Savannah during the week to work as a domestic laborer. He says he was teased for having very dark skin by other black kids.
Yet another reason that bullying is bad. The kid you bully could grow up to take away your voting rights.
That would be a good anti-bullying campaign PSA. No more bullying. No more Clarences. But it's true, the bullying at the hands of his black peers seems formative in his life story. You subject somebody with malignant Machiavellian personality to cruelty during their formative years, give them a series of incredibly lucky breaks, and they're going to spend the rest of their lives trying to exact revenge on the people who remind them of the people they blamed for their torment. Reading up on Thomas, it seems like he blames his mother and not his father, who abandoned his family, on his bleak early life, which again feeds into why he'd one day grow up to apparently hate women, and specifically black women, so very much. But then Clarence's luck turns. The shack where he lives burns down, which turned out to be one of the first in a series of extremely lucky things to happen to Clarence Thomas.
He was lucky that his childhood home burned down?
Some accounts say that Thomas's 2-year-old brother and a cousin burned the shack down while Clarence and his sister were at school. Some omit a perpetrator entirely, saying just that the shack burned down. But others say that Thomas and his cousin burned the shack down. The most fun version of this story is that Clarence did it, but honestly, the reporting is a little fuzzy, and we'll probably never know the real truth.
Very mysterious.
Clarence's maternal grandpa, Myers Anderson, agreed to take in Leola's 2 sons, Clarence and his little brother. But Myers Anderson was a huge piece of shit who, like many pieces of shit, hated women and refused to take Clarence's sister, Emma May. He only took in the boys. Now, some reporting says that it was the mother who sent the boys to live with Myers. Regardless, Clarence was an early beneficiary of sexist preference for male children.
That kind of upbringing could have demonstrated how bad misogyny is, but I'm guessing no lessons were learned.
Yeah, Myers Anderson was an abusive dickwad who didn't allow his grandsons to wear gloves when they worked on the family farm cutting sugarcane or butchering livestock.
Gross.
Unsanitary. But Myers had enough money to send his grandsons to private Catholic schools, which meant that by the time he was an adult, Clarence was both traumatized and entitled. What a great combo.
But wait, I thought I've heard Clarence talk about his past of going to all these bad schools and using it as a justification for, not funding public schools. Quote, if I can go to the shittiest schools in America and become a Supreme Court justice, what's your excuse kind of stuff? Like Fit Mom. Remember Fit Mom?
Well, at least Fit Mom walked her silly stances back rather than becoming an activist judge, mandating every mother maintain 6-pack abs. No, Clarence going to bad schools and being a bad student was another myth-making exaggeration. Thomas went to the best schools he possibly could have gone to. He thought he wanted to be a priest. He went to seminary for a year, reportedly overheard a white seminarian say he was glad that Martin Luther King Jr. had been shot. And then Clarence decided that seminary school was not for him. At this point, his grandpa, disappointed that his beneficiary was not going to continue on, cut him off, which meant Clarence had to work his way through the College of the Holy Cross in Boston. At the College of Holy Cross, Thomas was actually kind of groovy. He had a poster of Malcolm X displayed in his dorm room, spearheaded a black-led protest against racism on campus, attended anti-war marches.
Comrade Clarence!
He also got into black nationalism because he believed that the fucked up family structure that produced him, domineering father figure with absolute power and control over the other people in his house, should be replicated ad infinitum in American culture. While at Holy Cross, he met a young lady named Kathy Ambush. The two fell in love and got married in 1971, the same year Clarence graduated from college. The two had a son who is now 50 years old. Not only did Clarence have a pre-Ginny wife, he was married to her for 13 years, and she's basically invisible from the public record. Clarence's personal life pre-Ginny was, shall we say, untidy, but we'll revisit that in a second. Clarence graduated 9th in his class and attended Yale Law. And in continuing his grand tradition of hating every single rung on his ladder to success, he later put a 15-cent sticker on his law school diploma. That's because after he graduated, he didn't get any job offers for private sector law firms like he wanted, and decided it must have been because the private sector law firms suspected that he was a beneficiary of affirmative action. But rather than acknowledge that it could have been straight up racism, or perhaps his bad personality, or perhaps some combination of both that prevented him from skating into the next phase of his life, Clarence assigned blame to the wrong place, and he'd devote at least a portion of his career trying to make sure that no other kids with his background would ever have the opportunities that he had.
Whoa, by pulling up the ladder to a historic degree, is Clarence Thomas doing his part to prevent the existence of future Clarence Thomases?
That is some mind-bending shit. His private sector dreams dashed, Thomas went to work for Missouri's Republican Attorney General John Danforth. He was the only black person working in that office. He left that job to be an in-house attorney for a little misery merchant known as Monsanto, hated it, and went back to Danforth after Danforth's election to the Senate. This brings us to Clarence's convenient and ultimately very profitable pivot to the right. You see, Clarence made it to Washington, D.C. a little before Ronald Reagan did, and it was a really good time in the late 1970s to become an entry-level professional token for hire, thanks in part to a column written by journalist Juan Williams that got Reagan administration officials' attention. Clarence swore up and down that he would never take a position in government that had anything to do with civil rights, but then accepted a nomination as Ronald Reagan's Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the Department of Education, and later as head of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC. This was because Clarence Thomas was one of the only black people who thought Ronald Reagan was cool, and Reagan desperately needed somebody like Thomas in his administration to assuage the fears of white people who wanted permission to support Reagan without being seen as racists, even though many of them were, in fact, racists.
Oh, dear. So this is where to harken back to the MTV Real World tagline, people stop being polite and start getting real vibes kick in.
Yeah, Thomas gladly accepted the role of permission slip in the Reagan administration, even though the financial woes that would plague him throughout the 1970s would continue into the 80s. He and Kathy got divorced. During this time, his drinking was becoming a problem, he admitted in his autobiography. Still, that didn't keep him from his single-minded pursuit of profit and power. Now, remember how I said that Clarence Thomas has a history of lying about his past? He's also lied about his own family when it was convenient for him. According to a 1987 Atlantic profile of Thomas, in late 1980, a young Thomas told a conference of black conservatives that his now grown sister Emma May had become what would later in the decade be characterized as a, quote, welfare queen. This is what Thomas said, quote, "She gets mad when the mailman is late with her welfare check. That's how dependent she is. What's worse is that now her kids feel entitled to the check, too. They have no motivation for doing better or getting out of that situation."
I hope his sister had something to say about this, Erin, because if my sis talked that level of smack about me at a convention, we would absolutely not be doing our rendition of Sisters from White Christmas.
Well, years later, when Thomas was being considered for the Supreme Court nomination, the Washington Post's Karen Tumulty tracked down Emma May, who tells it a little differently. While her brother was attending law school at Yale and gearing up for a life of lapping out of Harlan Crow's ample trough, Emma May was working 2 jobs and raising 4 children on her own. She quit both of them to care for an elderly aunt after the aunt had a stroke. And the welfare checks that Thomas claimed the sister was dependent on barely covered utilities. And finally, Emma May was not a lifelong dependent on the system. She was only on government assistance for 4 or 5 years.
Okay, so it sounds like by the mid-1980s, Thomas was an ascendant Republican star on account of the fact that he was one of very few Black Republicans whose whole personality was based on openly disdaining the fact that Black people were ever granted opportunities, in part because they were Black.
Yeah, that's about it. And he had ongoing financial problems and a strong desire for revenge. As head of the EEOC, his credit was so bad that when he traveled, he needed to be booked in hotels that accepted cash payments because he didn't qualify for credit cards.
24-year-old Alyssa can relate.
Conservative activist and pioneering Karen Virginia Lamp met Clarence Thomas in the mid-1980s. As Clarence tells it, when he was at his lowest, despite being a high-ranking Reagan administration official. Ginny Lamp was the child of a couple of right-wing lunatics from outside Omaha, Nebraska, and proudly carried on her family's lunatic tradition through her weird childhood and into adulthood. Clarence and Ginny, in a setup Satan himself would envy, met at an anti-affirmative action roundtable and hit it off, so much so that Ginny offered to set Clarence up with some of her, quote, Black female friends.
Are the Black female friends in the room with us now, Ginny?
After Clarence got over the fact that he was personally uncomfortable with interracial relationships, Clarence and Ginny's horror novel romance kicked off, and the two were married in 1987. We could do an entire episode on the barfgasm that is their marriage, but for now, I'll leave you with this excerpt from a 2021 New York Magazine profile on the Nightmare couple. Quote, every year it gets better, Ginny told a gathering of Turning Point USA-oriented youths in 2016. He put me on a pedestal in a way I didn't even know was possible. Clarence had recently gifted her a Pandora charm bracelet. It has everything I love, she said. All these love things and knots and ropes and things about our faith and things about our home and things about the country. But my favorite is that there's a little pixie, like I'm kind of a pixie to him, kind of a troublemaker.
Who doesn't love things and knots and ropes, Erin?
Things and knots and ropes. Romance. This would mark the first and last time that anyone referred to white nationalist hag Ginny Thomas as a pixie. So in 1989, despite the fact that he was, by that point, more a bureaucrat than a lawyer, George H.W. Bush nominated Thomas to a spot on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which is objectively insane. Trumpian, even. Clarence was confirmed to the federal bench in 1990, and only a year later, the original George Bush nominated Clarence Thomas to replace Thurgood fucking Marshall on the Supreme Court. I cannot begin to explain what an enormous insult this was. Thomas was 43 years old and basically got the nomination because he was, once again, conveniently one of the only Black Republicans even remotely in a position to justify a nomination to the Supreme Court.
Just as a quick footnote here, I'd like to add that by the time Thurgood Marshall was nominated to the Supreme Court, he had authored 98 majority opinions, none of which was reversed by the Supreme Court. Just saying.
The worst part is that if Justice Marshall had just hung on for another 18 months, his replacement would have been picked by Bill Clinton and not George H.W. Bush. Marshall seems to have had an inkling that his replacement would be a sloppily selected hack job on the part of Bush. Check out this clip of Marshall just 3 days before Thomas's nomination went public.
Do you think President Bush has any kind of an obligation to name a minority candidate for your job?
I don't think that should be a ploy. And I don't think it should be used as an excuse one way or the other.
An excuse for what, Justice?
Doing wrong.
Marshall, when did you tell President...
I mean, for picking the wrong Negro and saying, I'm picking him because he's a Negro. I'm opposed to that.
I think he knew.
Think he knew. Okay, so now we arrive at Clarence Thomas's confirmation hearings, which I actually remember thinking were a sham while they were happening. I was a child.
Yeah, it's pretty wild to think about just how close we were to not having Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and what incredible shit luck led to him actually being confirmed, knowing what we know now.
So the confirmation hearings started in September 1991 with the Senate Judiciary Committee led by one Joseph R. Biden
Ooh, heard of
heading
him.
up the proceedings. Oh, Erin! Gonna have to do this part through my fingers like a horror movie.
Because Thomas was a partisan bureaucrat and not a judge, the senators had very little to go on when it came to how he'd rule. They tried to get him to talk about abortion because even back then, liberals and progressives were rightfully worried that conservatives had Roe v. Wade in their sights. But Thomas said he'd never really thought about the issue since he was done with his con law class before Roe v. Wade was even handed down. It was also during this first part of his confirmation hearing that he really leaned into the legend of poor Clarence he's trotted out every time his qualifications or intentions were brought into question. The way he told it, he was too busy worrying about paying his own bills to think about abortion back in the 1970s and 80s. His judicial record was so thin that the committee couldn't agree on Thomas, and his nomination proceeded to the full Senate on a 7-7 committee vote, which meant he was officially without recommendation.
That checks.
And that's before the Anita Hill news even broke. While it might have seemed like it to the average American, it wasn't like Anita Hill came out of nowhere. People in Washington had heard rumblings that Clarence Thomas had harassed the former fellow EEOC staffer since that summer. Meanwhile, Democratic senators and staffers started quietly raising a stink about the charges.
And also, meanwhile, Anita Hill, another Black Yale Law graduate, had already been approached about going public about the harassment she faced at the hands of Thomas, but was reluctant to for reasons that we all know were completely understandable. During this time, Joe Biden gave a statement to the press referencing Thomas's character, which hadn't been an issue during the hearings, which NPR reporter Nina Totenberg, a very important player in the Anita Hill saga, found strange, and she began to look into things.
Biden, being the D.C. rule follower that he was, approached the George H.W. Bush White House to ask them for permission to open an FBI investigation into the allegations, which the administration granted. Biden also called Clarence Thomas personally to let him know what was going on. According to a New York Magazine piece from 2021, Clarence held the phone up during that call so Ginny could hear too. In a move that will shock nobody, the FBI conducted a 3-day investigation into the allegations and concluded they were unfounded.
However, Nina Totenberg was on the case, and on October 6th, just days before Thomas's nomination was to go before the full Senate for a vote, she broke the story of Anita Hill's alleged harassment at the hands of Clarence Thomas.
And here's where this becomes the story of Democrats snatching defeat from the jaws of victory to hand one of the least qualified, perviest, most revenge-obsessed fringe freaks a lifetime appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court.
First of all, Democrats had a majority in the Senate at the time. The final vote on Thomas was scheduled to happen on October 8th, but Republicans knew at that point they didn't have the votes to confirm Thomas. And so Democrats allowed another round of committee hearings to get to the bottom of whether or not Thomas was an office sex pest and whether or not that mattered.
They basically handed Republicans a mulligan. Thomas got to testify in his redo first, characterizing the accusations as a, quote, high-tech lynching, and said some other over-the-top nonsense.
When any person in this free country would be subjected to this. This is not a closed room. There was an FBI investigation. This is not an opportunity to talk about difficult matters privately or in a closed environment. This is a circus. It's a national disgrace. And from my standpoint, as a Black American, as far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching for uppity Blacks.
Alyssa, you catching Ginny mean mugging in the background?
I see her laser eyes.
Laser eyes.
I have to tell you about this game-changing product I use before a night out with drinks. It's called ZBiotics. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly and you'll feel your best tomorrow. A couple weeks ago, I was invited to a dinner party on a Tuesday night, which, you guys, stresses me out because I record Hysteria on Wednesday mornings. But you know what I did? Took ZBiotics, went to the dinner party, had my glass and a half of wine, and you guys didn't even know the difference because I brought my A game to the show the next day. So 4th of July weekend is right around the corner, so stock up on pre-alcohol now for all your summer barbecues, vacations, and next day responsibilities. Go to zbiotics.com/guy to get 15% off your first order when you use GUY at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/guy and use code GUY at checkout for 15% off. Thank you, ZBiotics, for sponsoring this episode and our good times.
When Hill appeared before the committee, which at the time consisted of 14 white men, great optics guys, she accused Thomas of being a real fucking weirdo. He asked her out repeatedly. He bullied her to give him reasons that she kept saying no. He would talk extensively about his porn proclivities. Apparently, he was into bestiality and a performer named Long Dong Silver. And also the story of a pube left on a can of Coke.
The incident involved getting up from a work table, going to his desk, looking at this can and saying, "Who put pubic hair on my Coke?"
For the record, what substance did he bring up in this instance at EEOC in his office? What was the content of what he said?
Well, this was a reference to an individual who had a very large penis, and he used the name that he had been referred to in the pornographic material. The name that was referred to was Long Dong Silver.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so Erin, you have to understand, I was in high school. We watched this in real time. The Long Dong Silver jokes were rampant. And this is not America's finest fucking moment.
Watching it now, it's kind of astonishing how absurd the questions they asked of her were.
Thomas liked to discuss specific sex acts and frequency of sex, close quote. You said you took it to mean Judge Thomas wanted to have sex with you, but in fact, he never did ask you to have sex, correct?
No, he did not ask me to have sex. He did continually pressure me to go out with him, continually, and he would not accept my explanation as one as being valid.
So that when you said you took it to mean we ought to have sex, that was an inference, a mere allegation.
Senator, I would suggest to you that for me, these are more than mere allegations. These are the truth to me. These comments are the truth to me.
God, we owe her an apology.
So many apologies. In the end, it wasn't a high-tech lynching, but it did resemble something else, a witch burning. Biden would later go on to apologize to Hill for the way he handled things, but yikes, dude, talk about too little, too late. I don't want to heap shit on Joe Biden, though. Just about everybody on that committee showed their whole ass during those redo hearings.
Thomas was eventually confirmed by a 52-48 vote, historically narrow. 11 Democrats voted to confirm him.
Oh, boy.
What the fuck? He was sworn in to the Supreme Court on October 23rd, 1991. Now, Anita Hill was the only person who testified that Clarence Thomas had sexually harassed her during his confirmation hearings, but she wasn't the only woman who had corroborated Hill's story to the Democratic members of the Judiciary Committee. There were 4 witnesses who were prepared to testify during the hearings who weren't called. One of them, Angela Wright, said that Thomas had harassed her too, asked her bra size, also at the EEOC. She never testified. Their written affidavits are in the congressional record, and they are unrebutted. And reporting in subsequent years has only made Hill's claims seem like they're more likely to have happened than not happened. For example, a 1994 book by revered journalists Jane Mayer and Jill Abramson called Strange Justice, what a great title, went deep into Thomas's creepy obsession with consuming and discussing extreme pornography in wholly inappropriate settings. Like, for example, a Yale classmate told the authors that Thomas carried weird porn around in the pocket of his overalls. Why are you wearing overalls at Yale?
So many
Law?
weird things. So many weird things.
I can't wrap my head around that visual. A college classmate told the authors that Thomas had used sexual language so crude It could reduce normal people to tears. A guy who owned a naughty video store in D.C. recalled that, yes, Clarence had, in fact, been into an adult performer named Long Dong Silver. And another guy who knew Clarence backed this up. He would allegedly describe rape-themed pornography to anyone who would listen at work.
Okay, we don't need Olivia Benson to tell us that's some serial killer shit.
But the hits don't stop there. In a 2020 piece for New York Magazine, Jill Abramson lays out the case for impeaching Clarence Thomas, going over numerous ignored credible accusations surrounding the justice. An attorney named Moira Smith alleged back in 2016 that when she was 24 years old in 1999 at a dinner party at Clarence Thomas's house, she was warned not to sit next to the justice. He groped her while she was setting the table anyway. And again, later in the evening, a reporter followed up on the allegations, printing a deeply sourced story on them on October 27th of that year.
I have no memory of that story breaking.
That's because this was October 2016, and the story was published pretty much at the exact same time as James Comey announced that he was reopening the probe into Hillary Clinton's emails.
Fucking James Comey. Every day there is a new reason to hate that guy.
Abramson also uncovered a pattern of Thomas talking about his weird porn habits with his female colleagues at the EEOC, just like Hill said. At least 7 other individuals who weren't contacted to testify during the Thomas hearings went on the record stating that, yeah, Thomas was a creepy motherfucker.
Good lesson. If you're ever being sexually harassed at work, remember you are almost certainly not the only one.
Absolutely. Power in numbers. Clarence Thomas's ex-girlfriend, a woman named Lillian McEwen, told a Washington Post reporter that she was surprised that nobody from the Senate Judiciary Committee had contacted her about testifying. Around the time of the hearings, she'd even written Joe Biden a letter claiming she had personal knowledge of Thomas, but heard not a peep back. Plenty of friends and colleagues, many of them who agreed to be named, corroborated Hill's testimony. The problem was that nobody cared enough to do a thorough job when it mattered. As soon as he was sworn into his post on the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas stapled himself to conservative Justice Antonin Scalia's hairy ass, voting the exact same way that Scalia did 92% of the time. He was so off-putting that he motivated Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, a Reagan appointee, to move to the left.
Now, it's important to note that Thomas is a constitutional originalist, which means that by his own legal reasoning, he as a black man should not be considered a full U.S. citizen entitled to the same rights as white property owners because the framers of the Constitution would never have intended it that way.
Thomas, to add a cherry to that shit sundae, also believes that the courts should not be bound to follow precedent if he doesn't like the precedent. That gives him a lot of leeway in opposing, in his legal writings, such long-standing precedent as Lawrence v. Texas, in which the court decriminalized sodomy.
Weird that a guy who is so into animal and rape porn would be so obsessed with letting states make sodomy illegal again. What would become of his beloved pornography?
He would have to have a billionaire get it for him, I guess. Thomas has also written that the New York Times v. Sullivan, the 1964 First Amendment case, which established a high bar when it comes to public figures suing press outlets for defamation, might be on the chopping block if he had his way. And Gideon v. Wainwright, the 1963 case, which established that defendants who cannot afford their own attorney are entitled to one provided by the state. He has been on the evil side of just about every issue, almost always siding with police brutality, states that wish to carry out capital punishment, polluters who want to pollute more because it means they get to make more money. He votes to take away rights from women, to gut voting rights for everybody, to grant nearly unfettered power to sources of dark money who wish to donate unlimited amounts to politicians and their political causes without having their identities ever available to the public. He's written that the Affordable Care Act is completely unconstitutional. He's been horny to pretend that the framers of the Constitution meant for every American to have an individual right to carry guns around all over the place. And in 2022's Bruin case, he got the opportunity to do exactly that. And he seems to take a sick joy in hurting people. In the case of Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard, which struck down race-based consideration in college admissions, he read his concurring opinion from the bench, something that many legal writers at the time noted was unusual.
A man whose career was brought to you almost entirely by affirmative action. What a prick. It'd be like if John Wayne Gacy had tried to make clowns illegal.
That would have been funny. Sometimes Thomas even uses things that aren't even laws to justify his outlandish legal positions. Like in his dissent for Obergefell v. Hedges, the case that made same-sex marriage legal nationwide, he quoted the Declaration of Independence, the Magna Carta, which, while a legal document, is like not a law here in America, John Locke, and something made up called natural law. But you don't need to take our word for it. There are respected legal scholars out there who believe Clarence Thomas is among the worst, if not the worst, Supreme Court justice ever.
I'm Leah Littman, one of the hosts of Strict Scrutiny, here to talk to you about one of Justice Thomas's worst opinions, and that's Shin versus Ramirez, which might be a case you've never heard of. So in that case, Justice Thomas, writing for a majority of the court, held that it is illegal for a federal court to even consider evidence of your innocence, evidence that you're innocent of the crime you were convicted and sentenced to death for, if that evidence of your innocence never was introduced because the state appointed you multiple ineffective lawyers who never introduced evidence of your innocence. So the decision basically makes it illegal for federal courts to do anything when innocent people are sentenced to death. If that sounds wild, it is, but some of Justice Thomas's even wilder writings have come in separate writings rather than opinions for the court because he often can't get 5 justices to sign on to some of his more unhinged takes. Like when the court overruled Roe versus Wade, he wrote separately to say, hey, let's also overrule marriage equality, as well as the decisions protecting the right to contraception. So Justice Thomas's body of work contains more than a few of these gems.
For a more in-depth rundown of the goat rodeo that is the American legal system, tune into Strict Scrutiny's brand new YouTube channel.
Love those ladies.
In the Olympic tumbling gym that is Clarence Thomas's brain, the only thing that matters is the Constitution, which just so happens to mean exactly what the billionaires who bankroll Clarence Thomas want it to mean. Clarence Thomas is the dream Supreme Court justice for the billionaire fringe trying to steer America off a cliff because he doesn't care about the truth, logical consistency, or ethics. And apart from his nightmare boss antics, nowhere does his disregard for ethics show itself than in how nakedly, whorishly money-hungry he is.
Yeah, and despite his efforts to position himself among Washington's elite, it wasn't enough for him.
Yeah, about 20 years ago, Thomas complained loudly at a conference into a microphone that his salary as a Supreme Court justice was so low that he might have to step down so he could take a higher-paying job. And then what do you know? Somehow the amount of money he was making from sources outside his government paycheck skyrocketed.
Even though this sort of gift must be disclosed.
Clarence and Ginny Thomas's habitual non-disclosure of expensive gifts from wealthy conservative activists has long been the subject of media scrutiny. In 2004, the Los Angeles Times reported that billionaire and Nazi memorabilia collector Harlan Crow had gifted the Thomases a $19,000 Bible. Oh, Jesus would have loved that. That once allegedly belonged to Frederick Douglass. Oh, Frederick Douglass would have loved that too. And given over $100,000 to Yale Law School for something called the Clarence Thomas Portrait Fund. But nothing happened to Clarence Thomas at the time.
This guy's the luckiest bastard alive.
And again, in 2011, reports from multiple outlets found that Clarence and Ginny had failed to disclose or report more than $1.1 million in donations and income from conservative groups, in a pattern going back years. This time, the Thomases were chastened enough to amend the relevant documents so they met disclosure requirements.
But they sure didn't learn their lesson.
No way. Why would they want to learn that? In 2023, ProPublica reported that the Thomases were being taken on luxury vacations by billionaire Harlan Crow every single year and not disclosing it. In addition, Crow was bankrolling the private school education of Thomas's grandnephew, of whom Thomas had custody, to the tune of $100,000. It was Harlan Crow who had bought and renovated the house in Savannah, Georgia, where Thomas's mother now lives rent-free. Of course, when cases involving things that directly concerned Harlan Crow came up before the Supreme Court, Thomas didn't recuse himself.
Why would he, Erin? Why would he? There are no checks and balances for Supreme Court members.
Ginny was also getting a piece of the corrupt action. More 2023 reporting found that dark money ghoul Leonard Leo had funneled $80,000 to Ginny Thomas through split-end-ridden hate goblin Kellyanne Conway's organization in 2011 and 2012. Leo had instructed Conway to leave Clarence Thomas's name off all paperwork. Of course, Ginny's nonprofit had been a big-time cheerleader on the Citizens United case that led to this unstoppable flood of dark money in American politics in the first place. Clarence Thomas told the press that he and Ginny had scrimped and saved for an RV. But actually, the RV was a gift from yet another Republican megadonor who underwrote a loan worth $267,000, nearly $500,000 in 2023 money, that was magically forgiven in 2008. Thomas didn't disclose the gift. One positive thing is that maybe one day Clarence and Ginny can turn their fancy indoor boy vacation haven into a rolling Clarence Thomas library. That way, the library can just drive from billionaire to billionaire, as Clarence would have wanted. By this point, Clarence and Ginny's corruption was so brazen and unchecked that it became a bit of a joke. HBO's John Oliver even offered Thomas a salary of $1 million per year and a free $2 million RV if he'd retire from the Supreme Court. Unfortunately for America, that offer expired unclaimed after 30 days. Now, we all know that Ginny Thomas is a diehard switch seats so you don't have to sit next to her on an airplane right-wing nut job. She was very into the big lie after the 2020 election, supporting efforts to overturn the results in several states and trying to goad elected officials into unlawfully keeping Trump in power. She was also a big supporter of the January 6th rioters and got uncomfortably close to its organizers.
Of course, Clarence hasn't recused himself from a single case regarding the 2020 election or January 6th, because why would he? There are no consequences.
Until there's any accountability whatsoever for members of the Supreme Court, or Thomas retires or croaks, Justice Clarence Thomas sits on the bench, mostly silent, seething, probably thinking about porn, constantly pursuing quiet, petty revenge within a system with virtually no mechanisms in place to keep him in check. He bends to the whims of hyper-capitalist Christo-fascists who would sooner poison the earth and all of its inhabitants than sacrifice a few million of their billion-dollar fortunes. Now the only way out of this hell of Clarence Thomas's design is if somebody somehow gets hold of his internet browsing history. And there you have it, Alyssa. Clarence Thomas. Alyssa, on a scale of 1 to 5 weasels, where does the Honorable Clarence rank?
Erin, Clarence Thomas is a sex pest who dreams of having sex with pests that I have had to deal with my entire grown-ass life. So he is a 5 for 5, Erin. He is 5 for 5.
I'm going to say he's a hard 5. No pun intended. He's a hard 5. Even if all he had done was be a prolific bureaucratic sex pest, I would have ranked him like a 4. But the fact that he's a Supreme Court justice, he got away with it. He gets away with so much lying. He's a hard 5.
And that's this fucking guy, Clarence Thomas.
If you like what you just saw, please like and subscribe. And if you have an idea for a future subject of an episode of this fucking guy, be sure to leave it in the comments.
See you next time.